Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Thank you for being here, and a warm welcome to today's webinar on reducing inequalities in development policy and practice. My name is Paramita Datta, and I am a program analyst at UNRISD, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. Today's webinar is organized by UNRISD's program on translating research into policy and practice, which is based in Bonn, Germany. And it is hosted in collaboration with the GIZ on behalf of the BMZ, the German Federal Ministry of Innovation and Development. Today, we will be launching our sectoral guidance notes on inclusive and sustainable economic development, on social protection, and on climate change and just transition. We will also be introducing a special toolkit designed to help policymakers and practitioners address inequalities across sectors. The webinar will include two presentations. First, we will hear from Katja Huyo, who is the head of the UNRISD office in Bonn and leads the Transformative Social Policy Program at UNRISD. Katja focuses on social policy, poverty and inequality, the sustainability transition, and eco-social contracts. Following Katja, our expert, Emma Salmon, will present. Emma is a research associate in ODI's Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Program, with expertise in poverty and inequality analysis, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the 2030 Agenda. A very warm welcome to both the speakers. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available later on the UNRISD website and the YouTube channel. The chat box is available for comments and sharing resources and relevant materials to the webinar's themes and topics. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. We will address your questions in the Q&A section following the presentations. And finally, your feedback is important for us and help us improve. So once the webinar is over, you will be prompted to complete a survey about the event. The survey is anonymous and will only take a few minutes of your time. With that, I hand over to Katja to give us an overview and to set the context.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paramita. Also from my side, a warm welcome to all the participants. I will share my screen to give you a short introduction into the work that UNRISD does on the topic of inequality and what this webinar is about. So first of all, some comments about UNRISD, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, Research for Social Change. We are an independent research institute in the UN. We are already around for more than 6 decades. And our mandate is to put the social at the center of analysis. We catalyze voices from the Global South in research and activities, promote critical thinking and alternative and pluralistic perspectives, and provide evidence and analysis to improve policy and practice. And I would like to invite you to visit our website and see the different programs and projects that we are running. Now, inequality is a key issue for the research and for the advocacy and partnerships that UNRISD is taking forward. So as you can see, our research strategy that runs from 21 to 25 is framed around overcoming inequalities. Our last major flagship report that was published in 22 is on the crises of inequalities. And inequality is also a cross-cutting issue for all the programs in the Institute, whether it be the economic policies, environmental and climate policies, or gender equality policies. Now, let me give you a very brief introduction why inequality is important. Inequality is, of course, considered one of the greatest challenges in today's world, and not only because it undermines poverty reduction and sustainable development. Inequality is multidimensional and complex. Inequality has multiple drivers that are located in economic, political, social, and cultural spheres. And much of the current structures that we see are rooted in historical injustices. Economic inequalities have also increased tremendously in the neoliberal age. Inequalities resulting from discrimination and social disadvantage constitute an ethical and human rights concern, and they intersect with economic inequalities, creating entrenched forms of oppression and disadvantage. Now, when we try to understand inequality in order to address it better, we have to differentiate between vertical and horizontal inequalities, as I've already mentioned. So vertical refers to the economic dimension, and horizontal inequalities refers to the group or social identity dimension. We need to understand the concept of intersectionality. Again, I mentioned it in the last slide. Intersectionality occurs when different forms of inequalities come together. So when, for example, poverty and income inequality comes together with discriminated social identities. And this, as I said, creates very entrenched forms of disadvantage. We also need to consider equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes together. We need to understand the impact of the broader global, national, and local context on inequalities. So as you will hear also in the presentations, we talk about an enabling or a disabling environment in order to reduce inequalities. We need to understand the impact of inequality in SDG achievement. And this is one of the key motivations also why we have conducted this project. And finally, we need to analyze the drivers of inequality in different dimensions: social, economic, environmental, and political. Now, why are we concerned about inequality? Of course, inequality is important in its own right. It is very much linked to human rights, and giving everyone equal chances and equal possibilities to live a dignified and decent life. However, there are also a lot of arguments to be concerned about inequalities with regard to economic and social development. From an economic and social point of view, there are a lot of adverse impacts associated with inequality. It undermines growth, inclusivity, and poverty reduction. It is negative for productivity and human capital. It can reduce domestic demand and have adverse impacts on markets. It diminishes the quality of institutions. It can undermine stability. This was the key topic of our recent flagship report, that inequalities destabilize economies and societies. It has an adverse impact on state revenues, undermines access to social protection and social services, is detrimental for social justice, social cohesion, and undermines the effort to harmonize living conditions across social groups and location. And it is also negative for the environment and for addressing climate change. Also very interesting, but not so often discussed in the context of the United Nations, but increasingly so, is that inequality has also very detrimental political consequences. It can foster polarization and division, undermine solidarity and commitment to public policy. It creates sentiments of unfairness and injustice, undermining credibility and legitimacy of political systems and institutions. It can lead to apathy or political radicalization, replacing meaningful participation and citizenship engagement. And the wealth and power concentration at the top can lead to elite capture, political and policy distortions, and bias. So we often summarize all these adverse impacts of inequalities by saying inequality hollows out, undermines, erodes our social contracts. Now, inequality is very important, and fortunately, it has entered the 2030 agenda. And Andres was also quite instrumental in pushing, the international development community and member states to integrate an explicit standalone goal on inequalities in the 2030 agenda. And as you probably all know, there is a dedicated goal, SDG 10, that stipulates to reduce inequality within and between countries promote gender equality and leave no one behind. But there is also SDG 5 on gender equality, and inequality is a cross-cutting issue across many of the other SDGs. Now, what are the objectives of the guidance notes now? And how can these guidance notes that we will present today help us to address inequalities? As Paramita has already said, the bond program of UNRISD is aiming to channel research evidence and knowledge into policy and practice. So we try to harness research results and evidence in order to support policymakers and practitioners to address, SDGs and the current challenges that we face, and in particular, inequalities. So we want to provide policymakers and practitioners with the latest knowledge, evidence, and recommendations on how to reduce inequalities in 3 sectors: economic, environmental, and social. We also want to provide practical guidance for addressing inequalities in programming and project work, strengthening project cycle toolkits and checklists. And finally, we want to improve the understanding of inequalities and their consequences, and in turn raise awareness on consequences of sectoral policies and interventions on inequality. And we very much hope that these guidance notes, which we launched today and which are already available on our website, will support the policymaking and practitioner community in achieving these goals. So thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to invite now Emma to provide you with more insights on the substance of these guidance notes. Thank you.
You're on mute, Emma.
Thanks, Katja. I think you need to remove your presentation before I can share mine.
I'll try to. Yes.
Wonderful. So you should now be able to see my presentation?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So thank you very much. Katja has provided the background for this study in describing the rise in different types of inequality that motivated the production of these guidelines, and the need for a comprehensive response, which is spanning social, economic, and ecological aspects of sustainable development. So what I'd like to do in my presentation today is to give an outline of the strategies and the recommendations across the 3 sectors the guidelines cover. And I'd like to stress from the outset that this has been a collaborative project that has benefited from inputs across UN RISD and from earlier discussions with GIZ. Equally, we very much look forward to your input, your reactions, and feedback. The notes themselves, as Katja mentioned, are based on an in-depth review of the latest evidence in each area and aim to provide details of this evidence, as well as various toolkits that are available to apply the guidelines for each sector. So let me begin by giving an overview of the different outputs that are associated with this work, since there's a few of them, and how they complement one another. There are 2 key outputs. One is guidelines that pertain to different aspects of the project cycle, which is an expanded and elaborated version of an existing GIZ checklist for project planning and implementation. The checklist has components which cover project planning, project implementation, and monitoring and evaluation, respectively. And the other set of key outputs are policy guidelines, which relate to 3 sectors. The first is climate change and just transition. The second is social protection, and the third is inclusive and sustainable economic growth. And how policies in each of these areas have a role to play in reducing inequalities. And then there are also some cross-sectoral guidelines which apply equally across the three sectors. And these are relevant in taking into account how the different policy areas intersect with each other. And also because there are some general principles which apply in mainstreaming inequality reduction across the sectors. So I have the sort of heroic challenge of describing all of these. I'll turn first to the checklist and then to each of the sectoral policy guidelines, and finally give a very brief outline of the cross-sectoral principles. So of course, I'll spend just a few minutes on each of those to give you an idea of their contents and hopefully motivate you to look in more depth at the full set of documents. So let's move on, first of all, to the checklist. As mentioned, this has three separate components looking at project planning, project implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. The first is looking at, project planning. So this in turn has 5 different phases, each of which is accompanied by questions for project planners to guide thinking in terms of how inequality is pertinent in each phase of project planning. So first we look at information gathering, which aims to give insights into what information already exists, how inequalities have been framed, what approaches there are to inequality reduction in a given setting. The second phase is an understanding of context. So what are the most salient inequalities in terms of income, in terms of other aspects of well-being? What are the root causes? How are they experienced? We then look at analyzing different types of background information. So translating all of this background information to project design. Questions like, who is the project's target group? Have the voices and the perspectives of marginalized communities been sought and included? The next phase, it relates to strengthening the project design. So general questions concerning how the design of a project can ensure an inequality focus, as well as questions focused on specific aspects of inequality. It also asks project planners to think about any risks that might be associated with the proposed activities. And then the fifth phase is focused on operational considerations. So looking practically at logistical considerations, such as proposal preparation, indicator identification, logic and impact matrices, budgets, the sustainability of project activity. We then look at project implementation. Here there are 3 phases within this part of the cycle. Firstly, translating design to operation. So this phase is looking to ensure that operations planning recognizes differences amongst individuals and groups, minimizes any potential beneficiary shame, anticipates challenges in implementing policies to reducing inequalities. The next phase looks at cultivating shared understandings. So trying to determine whether and how the awareness, understanding, and collaboration of project stakeholders in relation to inequalities can be deepened. And then thirdly, addressing potential barriers to implementation. So looking at any potential challenges and barriers that could be encountered when mainstreaming different types of inequality reduction programming. Then the third and final section of the checklist pertains to monitoring and evaluation consideration, both in project planning and within existing projects. Within existing projects to adjust and align monitoring and evaluation tools and ensure that they're sensitive to inequality reduction. So it asks questions such as whether a robust monitoring and evaluation system exists, whether it's specific about what types of inequality it will focus upon and amongst whom, and whether there are processes in place to adjust project implementation based on evidence that's emerging from previous phases of the project. So that is, in short, in sort of a nutshell, the expanded checklist for project planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. I'd now like to turn to the sectoral guidelines. Again, I'll go through each of them in turn, giving a very brief outline of the contents and of the associated recommendations and examples of these recommendations, and referring you to the full briefs for the more comprehensive details. So the first note that we'll focus on is relating to climate change and just transition. Let me give you a very brief outline of its contents. It has three main themes. The first is the linkages between climate change and inequality. The second is the key types of policy instruments that could be considered in this area. The third is political economy considerations. And then from that, we go on to guidelines and recommendations to inform policy. So in terms of the links between climate change and inequality, we try to understand better how climate change is impacting inequality. So just some very selected examples. It increases various health risks, has a disproportionate impact on the poorest populations in poorer countries, particularly those who lack access to protective mechanisms such as insurance or basic health services. It's from an economic perspective, it's likely to disproportionately affect people in the poorest countries, those particularly who are most likely to rely on activities such as agriculture, forestry, and fishing, which are most likely to be affected by climate change. And returning to this theme of horizontal inequalities, it impacts disproportionately already marginalized groups such as women, indigenous populations, racial and ethnic minorities, the urban poor, and the informal workforce. So we show how climate change impacts different types of inequality and inequality for different groups. We also show how inequalities themselves can propel climate change. For example, by fostering carbon-intensive consumption and production, allowing wealthy elites to obstruct climate policies, weakening public support for climate policy, and undermining different types of collective action. We argue that climate change policies that are anchored in a broader just transition framework provide a way forwards in advancing societal justice in terms of responding to climate change. We outline key types of climate policy. So we look at mitigation efforts, which are aiming to reduce and sequester greenhouse gas emissions. We explore different types of adaptation initiatives, so aimed at adjusting to the actual or the expected impacts of climate change by reducing risks associated with harmful effects, such as extreme weather events or food insecurity, and exploiting potential benefits, for example, longer growing seasons or increased yields in some regions. And again, we give examples of specific types of initiatives. And we look also at complementary policies that we argue are needed to ensure that mitigation and adaptation reduce inequality and link with inclusive and sustainable economic growth and social protection, the other key sectors that we cover. And finally, we focus on political economy considerations, which are an issue that we revisit throughout each of the three guidance notes. Here, for example, in this note on climate change, we focus on the need for a rights-based approach. In the international arena, we emphasize the historical responsibility on countries in the global north to support low and middle income countries in climate change processes through aspects like concessional financing, technology transfer, other forms of assistance. And within specific countries, we highlight the need to identify those who are likely to support reforms and oppose reforms, and to craft policies that empower those who are pursuing a progressive agenda. So in terms of key recommendations, there are quite a few. And so rather than go through each of them individually, we'd be here for quite a while. What I'd like to do is to highlight the broad areas we're covering and I'll give now one example of each, and again, refer you back to the briefs for more detail. So the first area that we cover is identifying opportunities to strengthen the inequality reducing impact of climate change policy. One example is investing in access to health services to respond to climate-related health problems. The next general area is the empowerment of stakeholders, beneficiaries, other vulnerable groups. For example, encouraging legal reforms that would facilitate climate change litigation and the implementation of environmental laws. The third broad area we cover is efforts to bolster public awareness and engagement. So, for example, developing comprehensive education programs that would raise public awareness about the unequal impacts and burdens of climate change, and that those who have contributed least are most likely to be affected by its impacts. And the fourth area, and again, one which spans across the different sectors, is the importance of linking policies to ensure that they include social, economic, and ecological considerations. So, for example, ensuring that social protection strategies are taking into account and protecting groups who are facing the adverse impacts of climate change. So that's the first brief. I'd like to turn now to the second brief, which is focused on social protection. And again, I'll follow a similar format, giving a very brief outline of the contents and the key themes that are underpinning our recommendations. So here we are focused on types of social protection, how different types of social protection policies can reduce inequalities. We argue for the need for a universal and systemic approach to social protection, and again, raise some political economy considerations. In terms of types of social protection, we highlight the three most common types, so social insurance, social assistance, and labor market policies, each of which is, of course, important because it has different aims, is financed in different ways, and is supporting different segments of the population. So as most of you will know, social insurance policies are looking primarily at employment-related programs that are financed from dedicated contributions from employers and from employees. Social assistance policies are those providing in kind or cash transfers to those who may not be able to work or excluded from gainful employment. And labor market policies are aiming to promote decent work and equal rights in the workplace and protect workers from unemployment or different types of structural change processes that might require reskilling or other types of adaptation. A good example of this is climate change and the need for economies to transition to sustainable low-carbon growth models. So, having outlined the different types of social protection policies, we then look at ways in which social protection can reduce inequalities, how it can tackle vertical inequalities by redistributing income between different income groups and supporting, in particular, low-income households and workers, and also its role in tackling horizontal inequalities, both because they may be designed to benefit specific groups, such as women or people with disabilities, or because if policies are means tested, low-income and vulnerable groups may be more likely to meet the conditions for eligibility. We then argue that for a universal and systemic approach to social protection, we argue that universal systems are the most effective approach because to reducing inequalities, because in principle they cover the entirety of a population and are much simpler to administer. And within this, we highlight the need for progressive universalism, or the provision of quality public services for all members of a society, with specific attempts to include the most disadvantaged or direct higher benefits towards them. And we discuss the value of a comprehensive system rather than a series of fragmented programs. Once again, we revisit political and economy considerations, outlining various factors that might condition support for different types of social protection policies, and highlighting the importance of government activity in communicating about causes of poverty and clarifying different types of misperceptions regarding how beneficiaries of different types of policies may be using the benefits that they're receiving. In terms of the recommendations that are resulting from this review, the first theme that we stress is the need for promoting integrated and universal systems that are anchored in a human rights-based approach. For example, advocacy for universal social protection systems. We argue for the need to identify opportunities to increase the coverage and effectiveness of social protection programs. For example, developing specific strategies for extending coverage to groups that may be excluded or underserved, as well as regions that may be relatively neglected, and for coverage of different life cycle contingencies. The next area, again, is the need for the empowerment of stakeholders, beneficiaries, and other vulnerable groups. One example is the need for communication strategies that inform citizens of their rights, increase dialogue, and allow the airing of either grievances or different types of appeals. The next area we look at is the need to bolster public awareness and engagement. And as mentioned, there may be a need for specific communication strategies looking at public perceptions and beliefs about the causes of poverty and government responsibilities. And the final area here is the need to link policies across sectors once again to ensure that the different facets of sustainable development are included. So one example within social protection would be to look at opportunities to extend social protection to the informal workforce. So the third and final sectoral area that we look at is sustainable and inclusive growth. Here, the way that we frame this discussion is by looking at the primary and secondary distribution of income as key factors affecting the income distribution. We highlight the importance of labor market policy, in particular, of progressive fiscal policy, and once again, the need to account for political economy issues. So, first of all, we look at the primary and secondary distribution of income. We explain what it means and how it matters. So the primary distribution is concerned with how income is allocated within the economy before any active redistribution occurs, for example, through wages, through interest, or through profits. And then at the secondary distribution, or active government efforts to levy taxes and to put in place subsidies or social transfers, which can reshape the outcomes of the primary distribution. So we highlight the importance of government activity in shaping both distributions, in shaping the primary distribution through policies such as minimum wage regulation, support for unions, efforts to bolster the situation of the informal workforce, as well as the need to bolster the secondary distribution through investments in health and education that have the potential to bolster the human capital of the labor force. We stress the need for progressive fiscal policies, highlighting both taxation and public spending opportunities. And once more, we look at political economy considerations, such as the need for diagnostic assessments that could identify constraints to pursuing an inclusive growth agenda, as well as various possibilities for change and specific entry points for interventions. And we give examples of various types of assessment tools that can be used to this end. So again, let me give a sense of some of the recommendations that are coming from this work. The first is the need to foster inclusive, sustainable economic development by shaping both the primary and secondary income distributions. One example is identifying specific areas to intervene in each, using some of the policies that we've discussed: minimum wage policy, different types of supports to informal workers, support to labor unions. The second broad area we cover is looking for opportunities to promote a progressive fiscal policy. For example, ensuring that the taxation and spending are based on empirically sound analysis using tools such as fiscal incidence analysis and relevant equity budgeting frameworks. And we give some examples. Again, the third area is the empowerment of stakeholders, and here with a focus on the economically vulnerable informal workers. An example is the active involvement of informal workers, particularly those who are most economically vulnerable in different types of decision-making and collective bargaining processes. The next broad area is the need to bolster public awareness and engagement. One example is looking at ways of framing tax collection that could bolster public support and improve tax morale, for example, through transparent and fair tax administration. And then once again, linking policies across the sectors. And an example we give here is the need to promote decent work in green industries and other alternative sectors, as well as social protection schemes that include income and job support mechanisms. So finally, I'd like to touch very briefly on the cross-sectoral principles which apply across the policies and projects, regardless of their sectoral focus. And again, these are important both because projects and policies in each of these three areas are likely to impact one another, and also because there are some common themes in terms of what needs to be done to effectively mainstream inequality reduction across sectors and projects. We divide these general principles into three sections, into general principles, political economy considerations, and policy framing. So what you can see, first of all, is the general principles. So these are deliberately quite broad. First of all, ensuring that policies are recognizing and addressing prevailing inequalities, both in income as well as in other relevant dimensions of well-being, and including social, ecological, and political inequalities. The next is identifying the needs of the most disadvantaged and how their circumstances can be improved both relatively and absolutely, as well as highlighting any possibilities to reduce absolute gaps that may be separating better and worse off groups within a society. Given its importance, we engage once more with political economy considerations, broadly speaking. So looking at prevailing power dynamics that are perpetuating the status quo, including those relating to gender and how strategies can engage with these dynamics. Looking at the timing of reforms, that progressive reforms tend to be most sustainable when introduced either during prosperity or conversely following crises. And looking at specific strategies to counter vested interests, for example, through strengthening civil society organizations, avenues for legal empowerment, enhancing transparency and accountability, promoting inclusive policymaking, leveraging international assistance, and supporting public education campaigns. And then finally, we look at policy framing principles. So positioning all of the sectors that we've discussed within a rights-based and empowering framework to enhance trust and to promote policy longevity, ensuring that the policies include meaningful opportunities for disadvantaged groups to be involved in co-creating policy, participating in decision-making, and holding governments accountable. And finally, and as Katja mentioned, designing policies which take into account and stress intersectionality. And we argue that these policies need to be integrated within an inclusive system to ensure that they, avoid perpetuating any types of policy silos and neglect interconnected challenges. So thank you. With that, I will stop sharing and hand back over to Katja and Paramita.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you to both our speakers for the presentations. We will now move to the Q&A section of the webinar. I see a number of questions coming in. Thank you for the questions, and I've started grouping them to make the best use of our time. We have 20 minutes remaining. So the first couple of questions are on the practical application of the guidance notes and the checklist. We have a question on how is the checklist different from the prevailing M&E guidance in tackling the root cause of inequality? And then we have a question on how can we ensure that the research-based evidence will have an impact on decision makers, because oftentimes planners and decision makers on whom the guidelines are directed do not seem to consider what research shows. And a question related to that is, do you think that the guidelines would look different if we direct them to stakeholders or claim holders so that they get informed, organized, and mobilized to demand change? Katja, would you like to go first, and then we can go to Emma?
Yeah, thank you very much for these interesting questions. how are these guidelines different to existing recommendations on mainstreaming inequalities? I think what we try to achieve is to present a very holistic presentation of how inequalities, can be integrated, can be made more visible, and can be addressed in 3 sectors that are very crucial for SDG implementation, and where a large part of the current development cooperation and technical assistance is framed around. And what we have basically is this combination of an overview paper, that really informs the reader about the most recent state of the art in the 3 sectors, but also takes a critical lens. And this is very important from our perspective at UNRISD, that we are not only presenting the kind of business as usual or mainstream approaches to inclusive growth or to climate change or social protection, but that we really present a very broad set of policies and potential institutional reforms that integrate perspectives and experiences and case studies from the Global South that we have analyzed over the last couple of years. Of course, it's not only drawing on UNRISD research, as you will see. It is a very comprehensive discussion of the literature and the data that is available now, but we try to be cutting edge to a certain extent in terms of how we conceptualize inequalities and the linkages to these 3 sectors, but also in terms of the policy recommendations and what we consider to be a best practice or interesting, positive policy examples. Regarding the question of, who's the target audience of these guidelines, the discussion that I've seen also in the chat around, whether we should talk about stakeholders or rights holders, and whether actually the policy community that we try to reach with, these guidance notes is open to incorporate them, to take them up, and to implement them. First of all, I think these guidance notes were produced for practitioners and for those working in technical assistance and project implementation. However, that does not mean that these guidance notes are not also very interesting for people working in civil society and NGOs, and anyone who would say, I'm a player, in this field. I'm an advocate, for example, and I want to understand, how the inequalities, can actually be mainstreamed and can be incorporated in all of our development thinking and policy. So, we very much, would like to also reach students, academics, civil society, advocates, and other people who are interested in these issues. Whether the policymaking community is open to it, I would say that in the production of these guidelines, we had talks, we had interactions, we had interviews with people working actually as policy officers, as implementers in country offices and headquarters. And they usually are open, to do it. Of course, they know that inequalities are a major issue. It is not always easy to make them visible and to address them and to have this, bringing more complexity basically in the project work. But there is a lot of interest. There's a strong conviction with many of the workforce, of the staff working in development policy and practice, that this is really important and that we have to improve on it. We don't want to have unintended consequences. We don't want to work in silos. And we don't want to make things worse. If we talk about social protection, inclusive growth, and climate change policies, we also want to make sure that they are good for equality and that they improve opportunities and outcomes. So I think there is a lot of positive positive reception possible. What I see always as a problem or as a certain constraint that there are constraints in terms of time, in terms of trying to do this cross-sectoral work and to bring people together, as we suggest. And we recognize that sometimes implementation is not easy, but we want to put out these materials and this toolkit and hope that there will be a possibility to use it and to implement it.
Thank you, Katya. Emma, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think Katya's addressed that really comprehensively. I think maybe the one thing I would add to all that she said is that in addition to providing this intersectoral focus, I think one of the things that we try to do is look at how similar broad policy areas apply regardless of the sector. And by looking at these broad policy areas and how they translate into specific policies within each sector can give as Katja said, a sort of holistic and congruent approach to looking at inequality reduction, which we hope can be more effective.
Thank you, Emma. And there are a lot of questions coming in. The next set of questions is on inequality specifically. And so we have a question on under social inequality, to what extent gender, racial, ethnic, and caste inequalities play out, and how the guideline addresses these inequalities. And how would you make the case for effective institutions as one aspect for reducing inequalities? And there's a question on which countries have managed to reduce inequality in the past 10 years. So yeah, I have another set of questions, but I think that will be it. So Emma, do you want to come in first for these questions on inequalities? And
Yeah,
then...
no, I'm happy to. So the first question is asking how we thought about gender inequality and other types of horizontal inequalities. And I will say that we sought to take a very sort of broad and holistic conception of inequality, looking both at inequality and at inequality in other areas of well-being. Also looking at both vertical inequality, so inequality amongst individuals, as well as group-based inequality. So we applied this lens throughout the 3 policy areas. And so I think what we've sought to do in each of the sectoral notes is to look at how inequalities are being affected by climate change, by a lack of inclusive growth, by incomplete social protection systems, what types of inequalities may be accentuated by prevailing policy gaps, and specifically at what policies could do to redress these gaps with a focus on which groups are being marginalized and what types of processes would help to ensure their inclusion. So I would say that's very much a consistent focus throughout the notes. And as Katja mentioned, the importance of taking into account not only individual group-based inequalities, but also the ways in which these inequalities are intersecting. So I would say that's very much a cross-sectoral principle that guided us. In terms of the importance of effective institutions, yes, critically important. We tried to get at various aspects of this through our focus on political economy considerations within each sector. In some cases similar, and in some cases somewhat different political economy considerations that are involved, and what the implications are for policymakers in seeking to promote a more progressive agenda. So I'd say that's very much something that was uppermost in our thinking around how to structure the notes. And could you, I'm sorry, the third question I've forgotten. Would you mind just repeating it, please?
Sure. The last question was on countries that have managed to reduce
Yeah.
inequality in the past
Yeah.
10 years
Okay.
using some of these.
I think what we have done, rather than looking at inequality reduction as a whole, we've looked at the impact of specific policies in specific countries in terms of reducing inequalities. So examples that we give through the notes are, for example, the importance of minimum wage policy in Brazil in reducing income inequality within the country over a consistent period. We look at various types of social protection policies in different countries. I'll refer you to the notes for the details, Brazil amongst others. In terms of climate change, we look at various some small scale, some national types of policies in areas such as climate smart agriculture or adaptation to sea level rises. So I would say, or different ways of approaching carbon taxation, for example. So I would say, rather than taking this overarching perspective, what we've tried to do is highlight lots of examples of specific types of policies in different settings and the roles that they have had in reducing different types of inequalities. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Katya, would you like to comment?
Yeah, very briefly. Maybe just to say that in terms of identifying country examples that have been successful in reducing inequalities, one has to be aware of the fact that this is often, situated in a specific time period as well, and that, countries of course have a history and have structural inequalities that are, difficult to change in the short term. But some countries, and sometimes even entire regions, like, for example, Latin America, let's say between the early 2000s and up until 2015, have made, very considerable strides into inequality. And that was supported by, we know it, the commodity price boom. It was supported by, progressive policymakers that included, poorer people and integrated, lower middle classes into the social contract, expanded social rights, made a lot of reforms in the social sectors, but also in the labor markets. So there we see, during that period in Latin America, many countries who are actually reducing inequalities. And there are also a couple of countries in Africa and Asia who have reached that goal. However, this is never set in stone, it can always be reversed, and that depends very much on the international context, on the economic opportunities countries have, but also on the policy approaches of particular governments. Sometimes progress can be reversed, and sometimes the international environment turns so negative. And we have seen it during the COVID-19 pandemic. We see it now where the global north countries become more protectionist, where we have debt crisis, where we have a lot of economic problems. And then, addressing inequalities takes a backseat. That said, I recently came across a World Bank study that said that actually the number of countries that are classified as extremely unequal with a Gini coefficient above 40, that number has reduced actually. But on the other hand, we see a rising gap between rich countries and the very poorest countries. And we also, there are other numbers also saying that 3/4 of the world population are living in a country that has seen a rise in inequalities. So there is a lot of data out there. The picture is usually not very positive, but what we try to do in this guidance note is to really highlight those policy approaches that have produced good results. And there are many of them. So there is a lot of evidence that it can be done, but we need the right national policy environment, the right economic support, and also an enabling international context.
Thank you, Katya. Last set of questions on cross-sectoral engagement. What can the private sector do to support policy development or implementation in the 3 areas of the guidance notes? And would you have any advice on how vulnerable communities can participate in social policy? Emma?
Yeah. Okay, I think I'd like to start with the last question on guidelines for how vulnerable communities can participate. I think that is one of the themes that has been one of the themes that we have introduced in terms of the recommendations across the three sectoral areas. I think I mentioned a few times the need for the empowerment of marginalized communities in different contexts. I think one of the things that we've sought to do is to identify which are the specific communities that are likely to be vulnerable within specific sectors. So within the guidance on inclusive and sustainable growth, for example, we highlighted particularly vulnerable sectors of the informal workforce as likely to need policy attention. In the climate change notes, it depended a little bit on the context and the types of effects on climate change. But again, we sought to stress the need for vulnerable groups to be involved in co-creating responsive policy and highlight some mechanisms through which that could be done. Equally, in the social policy note, we stress the importance of vulnerable communities being treated as right holders and developing processes to incorporate any concerns that they might have and address any grievances that might result from the application of policy. So yes, I think that has been an important focus throughout the notes, though the processes in question will depend very much on the sector and, of course, on specific contexts within countries. What can the private sector do? Yeah, that hasn't been so much the focus of these notes. The focus is much more geared towards government policy policymakers. But I think, as Katja said earlier, they do have valuable information, I think, that would inform different stakeholders with an interest in inequality reduction, be it the private sector, be it NGOs, be it international organizations, be it anyone who is taking a serious interest in inequality reduction. And the different areas we address, I think, are ones that can be adapted to the needs of the specific stakeholders. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Katja, over to you to respond to these two questions and to give some closing remarks. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and sorry, we will not be able to take so many other questions that I see popping up. But Katja, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to the participants for all these interesting questions. And I would already invite you, to get in touch and to follow up with us, to send us your feedback, and also, if there are any questions that we can still respond to, feel free to send us an email. Yeah, on the questions, I think basically on how to engage vulnerable groups, I think what we tend to say in UNRWA is also, of course, we need to guarantee a meaningful participation for beneficiaries and for marginalized groups. And at the same time, we need, also a much stronger social contract where we have, alliances that really go beyond classes and income groups. So it's also very important that the middle classes and also elites kind of come back into the social contract and pursue common goals and the public interest. And part of that public interest is that everyone has equal chances and everyone has a decent and dignified standard of living. So it's important that vulnerable groups get a chance, but it's also important that we forge together society in a much stronger way, and we overcome this separation and polarization that is making things so difficult at the moment. And in terms of the private sector, of course, there's a lot the private sector can do, and it depends very much on what type of enterprise and what type of firm we are looking at. It's very important that the private sector it really engages with the Sustainable Development Goals and delivers on their duties across global value chains in terms of providing social protection to their employees and workers, respecting the fundamental rights at work, engaging in social dialogue, but also investing, and being proactive in finding solutions to make our current economic paradigm much more inclusive and sustainable. So I think there is a lot the private sector can do, and the United Nations for sure, but also development partners, of course, engage a lot with the private sector. That said, I would like to thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this webinar. I hope that we have given you some appetite to look into the documents and to use these guidance notes. This is not the end of the work on inequalities we are doing. We are preparing at the moment also to bring all this research, the focus on inequalities, and also this broader holistic perspective into important UN initiatives that are happening next year. There will be a second World Summit on Social Development happening in Qatar next year. There will be a Finance for Development conference. We will have a lot of opportunities to continue to inform these debates and continue to provide guidance and recommendations. And that said, I would like to invite you also to take part in a global consultation that we are currently running at UNRISD, where we want to hear about your opinions, what policymakers should do and should discuss and should move forward at the social summit that happens next year. So Paramita, I hope you can post the link to that consultation in the chat. And that said, thanks a lot. Thanks to GIZ and BMZ for supporting us. Thanks so much, Emma Summons, for the great collaboration we had on this project and on the production of these guidelines. And thanks to everyone who could join today. Thank you and goodbye.